A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You were standing at a check-in kiosk at the airport, or maybe you were just tapping through the app on your phone from the back of an Uber. You scan your passport, the little loading circle spins for a second or two, and then, boom, you have a boarding pass. In that 1 or 2 seconds, a silent, invisible handshake just happened between the airline and a government database thousands of miles away. Most people think their boarding pass is just a ticket, but it is actually a permission slip granted in real time by a sovereign state. But what happens when that handshake fails? What happens when you have the visa, you have the ticket, and you have the clean record, but you still end up being detained the moment your feet touch the tarmac?
It is a high-stakes digital negotiation, CORN. I am Herman Poppleberry, and I find the architecture of this handshake absolutely fascinating because it is where the friction of national borders meets the seamless expectation of modern travel. Today's prompt from Daniel is about that exact intersection. He wants to know how airline security integration actually works and why some people still end up getting deported at the gate in places like Israel, even when they think they have all their paperwork in order. It is a question that touches on everything from legacy mainframe code to high-level international diplomacy.
It is a great question from Daniel because there is this widespread assumption that there is just one big global no-fly list that everyone checks. Like there is a master spreadsheet of bad actors sitting on a server in Geneva or something that every airline pings before they let you on. But the reality is much messier, way more fragmented, and honestly, way more interesting from a technical perspective. We're talking about a patchwork of databases that do not always talk to each other in the way you would expect.
You are right to point that out. The term no-fly list is often used as a catch-all, but we need to be precise here. In the United States, for example, the no-fly list is actually a very specific and relatively small subset of the broader terrorist screening database. As of March 2025, that system actually went through a massive rebrand and mission expansion. The Terrorist Screening Center was renamed the Threat Screening Center. That was not just a cosmetic change. It reflected a shift toward including transnational organized crime, like the cartels that were recently designated as foreign terrorist organizations. So the scope of who is being watched is expanding, but the mechanism for how an airline knows to stop you is what we really need to dig into.
So, before we get into the weeds of the tech, let us define the terms. Is a no-fly list the same thing as being inadmissible to a country? Because those feel like two different buckets.
They are completely different buckets, though they often get conflated. A no-fly list is generally security-focused. It means the government believes your presence on an aircraft is an inherent threat to the safety of the flight or the public. Immigration, inadmissibility is policy-focused. You might be a perfectly safe person who has never broken a law, but if you do not meet a country's entry requirements, or if you are on a political blacklist, you are inadmissible. The technical challenge for airlines is that they have to check both of these boxes simultaneously during that 2-second loading screen.
That is a lot of pressure on a check-in app. So, if I am flying from London to Tel Aviv, how does the Israeli government know I am on that plane before I even leave the ground? Is the airline just emailing them a PDF of the manifest once the doors close?
Not quite. We have moved far beyond the era of manual lists and faxed manifests. The backbone of this entire process is something called APIS, or the Advanced Passenger Information System. It was originally developed by U.S. Customs back in 1988, but it has since become the global standard. In fact, multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions like 2178, 2396, and 2482 actually mandate that all member states implement these systems to track foreign terrorist fighters and other threats.
I remember we touched on some of the logistics of this when we talked about LL's security model back in episode 1138. But for the average airline, how does APIS actually function during that check-in process?
There are two main flavors of this. The legacy version is just batch, APIS. The airline collects your data, your full name, date of birth, nationality, and passport number, and they send it as a big file to the destination country's border authority. Usually, they do this shortly after the flight departs or right before the gate closes. The problem with batch APIS is that it is reactive. The plane is already in the air by the time the border agents see the list.
Which explains why you might see a plane met by police on the tarmac once it lands. But that feels like a failure of the system if the goal is to prevent the travel in the first place. If the person is a threat, you do not want them in a pressurized tube at 30,000 feet.
Which is why we have seen the rise of IAPI, or Interactive Advanced Passenger Information. This is the real-time version. When you check in, the airline system sends a query to the destination country's database. Within milliseconds, the government server sends back a coded response. It is usually either an OK to board or a do not board signal. If the airline gets a do not board, the system literally will not let the agent print your boarding pass or allow you to clear the digital check-in on your phone.
That is the technical choke point. The airline essentially becomes an unpaid deputy of the destination government's border force. They are the ones who have to tell the passenger, sorry, you are not going today. But here is the thing that Daniel mentioned in his prompt that I find really curious. We have seen cases recently, especially in Israel, where high-profile activists or even politicians make it all the way to Ben Gurion Airport only to be detained and deported. If this IAPI system is so fast and integrated, why are they getting on the plane at all?
That is the million-dollar question, and it reveals the gaps in the global architecture. Look at what happened in April 2025 with the British members of Parliament, Yuan Yang and Abtisam Mohammed. They were detained at Ben Gurion and deported, which caused a massive diplomatic row with the UK Foreign Secretary, David Lammy. Or even earlier in February 2025 when European Parliament deputies Rima Hassan and Lynn Boylan were stopped. If the system worked perfectly, they should have been flagged at Heathrow or Dublin or wherever they started.
So where is the gap? Is it a technical failure or a policy choice? Why does the OK to board signal fire for a sitting member of parliament who is clearly on a blacklist?
It is usually a mix of both. First, you have to realize that API adoption is still uneven globally. Not every airline in every country has a perfectly synchronized real-time link. Some routes might still be relying on the older batch, AP1S protocols, where the data is sent while the plane is taxiing. But more importantly, there is a difference between being on a security-based no-fly list and being on an immigration inadmissibility list.
Right, because being a security threat is one thing, but being barred because of your political activities, like supporting the BDS movement, is a different category of data.
The mechanism is different. Israel has Amendment number 28 to the Entry into Israel Law, which was passed back in 2017. It basically says the government can deny entry to any foreigner who publicly calls for a boycott of Israel. To enforce that, the Population and Immigration Authority maintains a blacklist. But that blacklist is not necessarily baked into the automated IAPI system of every foreign airline.
So the airline system might check the international security databases and see that the passenger is not a terrorist, and since they have a valid visa or are from a visa-exempt country like the UK, the system says, OK to board. The specific BDS blacklist might only be triggered once the passenger's data hits the Israeli Border Control's internal system, which might happen while the plane is mid-flight.
Or even later. In many cases, the final determination is made by a human being at the border desk. This is where we get into the human-in-the-loop intelligence. Israeli border agents are known for being incredibly thorough. They are not just scanning your passport, they are looking at patterns. They might do a quick search of your social media or look at your travel history. We saw this with a British tourist in 2025 who was deported specifically because of anti-Israel posts on social media. That is not something an automated IAPI check is going to catch at a check-in kiosk in London unless that person is already a high-priority target with a flag on their passport number.
That social media aspect is wild to me. It means the border is no longer just a physical line. It is this digital shadow that follows you. And if you are a prominent figure like Rima Hassan, who was also intercepted on the Gaza flotilla vessel Madeleine in 2025, your name is going to be high priority. But if you are a low-level activist, you might slip through the automated cracks only to be caught by the manual ones.
And the consequences of being caught at the destination are much harsher. If you are denied entry at Ben Gurion, you are usually handed a 10-year ban. You are held in a detention facility, often called the Facility for Those Denied Entry, until a flight is available to take you back. It is an expensive and logistical nightmare for the airline too, because under international law, if an airline brings an inadmissible passenger to a country, the airline is often responsible for the costs of flying them back, and might even face heavy fines.
You would think the airlines would be begging for better integration then. If I were running an airline, I would want to know for certain if someone is going to be turned away before I give them a seat that I could have sold to someone else. It seems like a massive waste of fuel and resources to fly someone across the world just to have them sit in a detention cell and fly back.
You would think so, but the technical debt in the travel industry is staggering. We talked about this in episode 669, how a lot of these systems are still running on legacy code. Integrating a new, real-time government blacklist into a global distribution system used by hundreds of airlines is a massive undertaking. Plus, there are privacy concerns and legal hurdles. Does a sovereign state like Israel want to share its entire internal BDS blacklist with a private airline in a foreign country? Probably not. They would rather keep that data close to the chest and do the final screening themselves.
It is a classic sovereignty play. If you give the list to the airline, you lose a certain amount of control over how that data is used or who sees it. But by keeping it internal, you accept the friction of having to deport people once they arrive. It is almost like the state wants to maintain that element of surprise, or at least the final word.
There is also the diplomatic angle. When Israel deports a sitting British MP or an MEP, it is a big statement. It is a way of enforcing national law and sending a message about their stance on BDS. If they just quietly blocked them at the check-in counter in London, it might not have the same weight, though it would certainly be less of a headache for the diplomats involved.
I want to go back to the data itself for a second. We talked about APIS, but Daniel also mentioned the passenger manifest. There is another layer here called PNR data, right? Passenger name record? How does that differ from the passport scan?
PNR is much deeper than APIS. A PIS is basically just your passport data. PNR is your entire booking history. It includes who you are traveling with, how you paid for the ticket, your contact information, and even things like your meal preferences or frequent flyer details.
Wait, meal preferences. How does a government use that for security? That sounds like something out of a spy novel.
It sounds trivial, but it is all about pattern matching and risk scoring. Security agencies use PNR data to build a profile. If someone pays for a one-way ticket in cash at the last minute and requests a specific type of meal that suggests a certain cultural or religious background, that might trigger a higher risk score in an algorithm. It is not necessarily about the meal itself, but about how all these tiny data points correlate with known threat patterns. Many countries, including the US and the EU, now require airlines to hand over this PNR data well in advance of the flight.
So it is not just a list of names, it is a multi-dimensional dataset. This explains why the US renamed its center to the Threat Screening Center. They are moving away from just looking for people on a list to looking for behaviors and associations that suggest a threat, whether that is terrorism or organized crime.
That is the shift. In 2025, the US officially started using these aviation screening tools to target cartels. If you are a known associate of a cartel in Mexico, you might find yourself on a list that prevents you from flying into the US, even if you have never been charged with a crime. It is about using the aviation network as a defensive perimeter.
Let us talk about the legal side of this. We mentioned Lara Al-Qassem earlier. She was that American student who was held at Ben Gurion for weeks back in 2018 because of her past BDS activity. Her case was actually really interesting because it went all the way to the Israeli Supreme Court.
That is a landmark case for this topic. Al-Qassem had been a president of a small BDS chapter at her university in Florida. She was allowed to board her flight, but when she landed, the border agents flagged her based on her past activity. She argued that she was no longer active in the movement and was just there to study at Hebrew University. The Supreme Court eventually ruled in her favor, saying that the law was intended to prevent active boycotters who might use their presence in Israel to cause harm, not to punish people for their past views.
That suggests the system has a bit of a human safety valve, at least if you have the resources to fight it in court. But for most people, the decision of that border agent is final. You are not getting a Supreme Court hearing while you are sitting in the detention facility waiting for the next flight to London.
And the system is becoming more automated, which makes those legal appeals harder. If the decision is made by an algorithm based on PNR data and social media scraping before you even arrive, how do you even begin to challenge that? We are seeing a move toward what I call the algorithmic border. It is no longer just about who you are, but what the data says you might do.
It feels like the concept of international travel is becoming more fragile. We have this expectation that if we have money and a passport, we can go anywhere. But Daniel's prompt highlights that we are actually moving through a series of gated digital communities.
That is a perfect way to put it. And Israel is really at the forefront of this because their security needs are so acute. They have to balance being a global tech hub and a tourist destination with the reality of being surrounded by hostile actors and facing a global boycott movement. Their use of Amendment 28 is a very literal application of sovereignty in the digital age. They are saying, our border starts at your keyboard.
I wonder about the role of the airlines in all this. They are stuck in the middle. They want the revenue from the passengers, but they do not want the fines or the bad PR of a deportation. Are we going to see a point where airlines start doing their own independent political screening to protect their bottom line?
We are already seeing a version of that with internal ban lists. Airlines have always had lists of disruptive passengers. But as of 2025, there is still no global requirement for airlines to share those lists with each other. If you are banned from Delta for being a jerk, you can usually still fly on United. But there is a lot of pressure in the US right now to create a national shared ban list for unruly passengers. If that happens, it is just one small step toward a more integrated private-public screening network.
It is the ultimate convergence. You have the government security lists, the immigration policy blacklists, and then the airline's own behavioral lists, all of them feeding into that 1 or 2 second loading screen when you check in.
What I find really wild is how this extends into international waters too. Think back to the Gaza flotilla interception in 2025. The activists on the Madeleine were intercepted by the IDF in the eastern Mediterranean. They were not even at a land border or an airport. They were transferred to Ben Gurion specifically so they could be processed through the formal deportation system and handed those 100-year bans. It shows that the border is a legal construct that can be moved wherever the state needs it to be.
100-year ban. That is basically a life sentence for travel. It is a very effective way of ensuring that someone like Rima Hassan, who was on that boat, cannot easily return to continue her activism on the ground. It is a digital wall that lasts a century.
And it creates a huge diplomatic headache. When you have MEPs and MPs being treated this way, it strains the relationships that are necessary for the technical cooperation we have been talking about. If the UK or the EU gets fed up with how their citizens are being treated at the Israeli border, they might be less willing to share the deep PNR data that Israel relies on for its security screening.
So there is a feedback loop. The more aggressively you enforce these bans, the more you might undermine the data sharing that makes the enforcement possible in the first place. It is a delicate balance between national security and international cooperation.
It is a very delicate balance. But from a technical standpoint, the trend is clear: more data, more real-time integration, and more automation. The goal for border authorities is to move the point of denial as far away from the physical border as possible. They want to stop you at your house, or at least at your local airport, rather than at their front door.
This really reframes the whole idea of an okay to board signal. It is not just a technical handshake, it is a real-time judgment on your worthiness to enter a country. It is the primary gatekeeper of the 21st century.
It really is. And for travelers, the takeaway is that a visa is not a guarantee. You can have every document in the world, but if the destination's internal blacklist has been updated since you got that visa, or if an algorithm flags your recent social media activity, that boarding pass is going to stay locked.
So, what is the practical advice here? Beyond the obvious stuff like not being a terrorist, if you are someone who is politically active, how do you even know if you are on one of these lists?
That is the problem. Most of these lists are opaque. In the US, you can apply for a redress number if you think you are being wrongly flagged for extra screening, but you will never actually see the list itself. In Israel, the BDS blacklist is not public. You only find out you are on it when you are denied entry. The best you can do is understand that your digital footprint is part of your travel documents now. Everything you post, every organization you join, it is all potentially being ingested by these systems.
It makes the world feel a lot smaller, and not in a good, cozy way. It feels like the walls are getting higher, even if they are made of code instead of concrete. We are moving toward a world where your face and your data are your only real passport.
And that brings up the AI piece of this. As these systems start using machine learning to predict who might be a threat or who might be intending to violate their visa terms, the margin for error could get really weird. Imagine being denied entry not for something you did, but because an AI thinks you look like someone who might do something.
It is the Minority Report of travel. We are already seeing the beginnings of that with risk-scoring algorithms. The next step is integrating real-time facial recognition at every gate, linked to these global threat databases. It is a massive technical challenge, but the infrastructure is being laid right now.
It really puts the weird in my weird prompts. Daniel really hit on a topic that affects every single person who steps on a plane, whether they realize it or not. You are not just checking in, you are asking for permission from a global security apparatus.
It is the invisible architecture of the world. Well, Herman, I think we have thoroughly deconstructed the handshake. It is a bit more complicated than a simple hello.
To say the least. It is a complex, multi-layered, and deeply political process that is only going to get more integrated as time goes on.
I think that is a good place to wrap this one up. We have covered the shift from batch APIs to real-time IAPI, the deep dive into PNR data, and how countries like Israel use these tools to enforce specific laws like the BDS ban.
And the big takeaway is that the border is now digital, real-time, and increasingly automated. Your boarding pass is the final result of a massive global data exchange.
Thanks to Daniel for sending this prompt through. It is always interesting to see how these technical systems we take for granted are actually doing a lot of heavy lifting behind the scenes.
And thanks to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning on this show.
We also want to give a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. We literally could not do this without them.
If you found this deep dive into airline security interesting, you might want to check out episode 669, where we talked about how NOT, AMS, or notices to air missions are used to telegraph global conflict in real time. It is another great example of how the aviation world and geopolitics are totally inseparable.
This has been my Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying the show, a quick review on your podcast app really helps us reach new listeners and keeps the brothers talking.
You can find us at myweirdprompts.com for the RSS feed and all the ways to subscribe.
See you in the next one.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts.